The Ukraine-Russia conflict is more than a regional dispute, it is a critical flashpoint in global geopolitics, affecting international security, economic stability, and the future of rules-based international order. The war that erupted in February 2022 when Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine has deep historical, political, and cultural roots. It has evolved into a protracted and devastating conflict with tens of thousands of lives lost, millions displaced, and billions of dollars in damages and global economic losses. This conflict is emblematic of the larger struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, national sovereignty and imperial ambition, and East-West power politics. Ukraine, once a Soviet republic, has increasingly aligned itself with the European Union and NATO, seeking closer integration with the West. Russia, under Vladimir Putin's leadership, has viewed this shift as a strategic threat to its sphere of influence and regional hegemony. The war has also laid bare the limitations of international institutions in preventing aggression, upholding human rights, and enforcing peace. Despite widespread condemnation, heavy sanctions, and international aid to Ukraine, the conflict has persisted, intensifying over time. In this analysis, we will explore the historical backdrop that led to the modern Ukraine-Russia conflict, the key events that triggered the current war. We will also examine potential scenarios and strategies for ending the conflict, with an emphasis on sustainable peace, justice, and reconstruction. On February 24, 2022, the long-simmering conflict between Ukraine and Russia erupted into a full-scale war. In a dramatic and widely condemned move, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a special military operation against Ukraine. The invasion marked the largest military attack on a European country since World War II and stunned the global community. It also shattered the illusion that Russia's ambitions were limited to Crimea and Donbass. As Russian forces occupied parts of Ukraine, disturbing reports of war crimes emerged. In Bucha, mass graves and bodies of civilians were discovered after Russian withdrawal. Cities like Mariupol were bombed indiscriminately, killing thousands and destroying civilian infrastructure. Russian troops were accused of torture, rape, summary executions, and forced deportations of Ukrainian civilians to Russian territory. The UN and international human rights groups launched investigations into these atrocities. The International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for President Putin in 2023, citing alleged involvement in the unlawful deportation of children. The war triggered a massive humanitarian crisis. Infrastructure was decimated. Millions lacked access to water, electricity, and medical care. Agricultural exports were halted, contributing to a global food crisis. The world, take the notes, responded swiftly and decisively to Russia's invasion. Sanctions, the United States, European Union, UK, and others imposed unprecedented economic sanctions targeting Russian banks, oligarchs, the central bank, and major industries. Russia was removed from SWIFT, its foreign reserves were frozen, and its economy was pushed into crisis. Military aid, Ukraine received billions in military assistance from NATO members. The US alone provided advanced weaponry, intelligence, and training. European countries supplied artillery, drones, and air defense systems. Diplomatic isolation, Russia was condemned in the UN General Assembly by an overwhelming majority. Many countries downgraded diplomatic ties or expelled Russian diplomats. Support for refugees, over 8 million Ukrainians fled to neighboring countries like Poland, Romania, and Germany. The EU activated emergency protections, offering housing, work permits, and education. Despite these measures, NATO and the US repeatedly ruled out direct military intervention to avoid sparking a wider war with a nuclear-armed Russia. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a watershed moment for Ukraine. Over 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence in a referendum, including a majority in Russian-speaking regions like Crimea and Donbass. However, the newly independent Ukraine faced immense challenges: economic instability, corruption, and the task of building democratic institutions. Russia initially accepted Ukraine's independence, but its leaders remained wary of Ukraine's westward leanings. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, seemed to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty. However, the lack of legally binding enforcement mechanisms would later become a critical flaw. In the post-Soviet period, Ukraine found itself caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war. Western institutions, particularly NATO and the European Union, became attractive models for political reform, economic development, and security. While not universally embraced by all Ukrainians, especially in the East and South, the drive toward integration with the West gained momentum over the years. The period between 2004 and 2013 marked a critical turning point in Ukraine's modern history, as the country grappled with political identity, economic challenges, and the competing influences of Russia and the West. In late 2004, Ukraine experienced its first major pro-democracy uprising since independence, the Orange Revolution. Sparked by widespread allegations of electoral fraud in the presidential election between Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian candidate, and Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-European reformist, mass protests erupted across Kiev and other major cities. Millions of Ukrainians, dressed in orange, Yushchenko's campaign color, took to the streets demanding fair elections and democratic reforms. The Supreme Court of Ukraine ultimately annulled the fraudulent results and ordered a rerun, which Yushchenko won. Though the revolution was peaceful and hailed globally as a victory for democracy, its aftermath revealed the fragility of Ukraine's political system. Yushchenko's presidency was marred by infighting, economic difficulties, and a failure to deliver on many promised reforms. Ukraine's energy dependence on Russia became another flashpoint. Russia, through its state-owned company Gazprom, supplied much of Europe's natural gas via pipelines running through Ukraine. Disputes over gas pricing, alleged debt, and contract violations led to a series of gas wars between 2005 and 2009. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, who had lost in 2004, made a political comeback and was elected president in what was widely regarded as a free and fair election. His victory signaled a shift back toward Moscow, and he quickly took steps to consolidate power and steer Ukraine closer to Russia's sphere of influence. Corruption increased, and democratic institutions weakened under his rule. In 2013, Ukraine was on the brink of signing a long-negotiated association agreement with the European Union. However, under pressure from Moscow, which threatened trade sanctions, Yanukovych abruptly suspended it. This decision triggered immediate and massive protests in Kiev, is known as Euromaidan. These protests would eventually lead to the ousting of Yanukovych and the most significant shift in Ukrainian politics since independence, events that Moscow would interpret as a Western-backed coup. In late February 2014, unidentified armed personnel, later confirmed to be Russian special forces, seized key government buildings, airports, and infrastructure in Crimea. These soldiers, wearing unmarked green uniforms, were dubbed Little Green Men. Within days, they had effectively taken control of the peninsula without a single major battle. On March 18, 2014, President Vladimir Putin signed a treaty officially incorporating Crimea into the Russian Federation. In April 2014, shortly after Crimea's annexation, pro-Russian demonstrations escalated into armed uprisings in several cities in eastern Ukraine. Militant groups, often backed or led by Russian nationals and operatives, seized government buildings and declared the creation of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Till the 2021, the war in Donbass had killed over 14,000 people, displaced over 1.5 million, and left millions more in dire conditions. Civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, water facilities, suffered extensive damage. Landmines and unexploded ordnance made the region dangerous for returning residents. After more than a decade of conflict, including a devastating full-scale war that began in 2022, both Ukraine and Russia remain locked in a bitter struggle. The war has reshaped global politics, wrought immense human suffering, and exposed the fragility of international order. For both sides, minimum conditions for peace remain incompatible. Ukraine's core demands: full restoration of territorial integrity, including Crimea and Donbass. Withdrawal of all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory. Accountability for war crimes. Security guarantees to prevent future invasions. Russia's position: retention of territories annexed, illegally, under international law. Recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. Guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO. Lifting of economic sanctions. A negotiated ceasefire or peace agreement, while difficult, remains the most plausible route to stopping the violence. This could take several forms. Armistice with demilitarized zones. A Korea-style armistice, leaving territories contested but freezing active fighting, monitored by international observers, e.g., OSCE or UN peacekeepers. Phased withdrawal and referenda. Russia could withdraw in stages, with internationally supervised referenda in some disputed regions. However, such votes are controversial and likely unacceptable to Ukraine given coercion in occupied territories. Neutrality guarantee. Ukraine might agree to forego NATO membership in exchange for powerful security guarantees from major powers like the US, UK, France, and Germany. Some analysts argue that only a clear military victory by one side will end the war. But both options are fraught with risks. Ukrainian victory, i.e., total Russian withdrawal, requires sustained Western support. Risks nuclear escalation if Crimea is threatened. May destabilize Russia internally, creating regional uncertainty. Russian victory, e.g., consolidation of eastern Ukraine, would encourage global authoritarianism, likely to be met with enduring Western sanctions and resistance from Ukrainian partisans. Neutral states or coalitions, e.g., Turkey, China, Brazil and now America, could mediate peace talks. While China has offered vague peace plans, most were viewed as biased toward Russia. A UN-sponsored framework, though legally valid, is hindered by Russia's veto power at the Security Council. The Ukraine-Russia war is a defining conflict of our era. It is not only a battle for territory but a test of international law, national sovereignty, the resilience of democratic values. The road to peace is long and uncertain. It requires visionary leadership, enduring international solidarity, accountability for crimes committed, investment in rebuilding lives and futures.